This is a special edition of the Minnesota Majority Report.
You are about to watch your president, who's just won the Nobel Peace Prize, go to Copenhagen in 2 weeks, 3 weeks from when we record this broadcast. This will be December, first 2 weeks of December 2009. And there will be the conference of the states parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I have read the draft treaty. I'm one of the very few people in the world outside the narrow coterie that have put it together that have seen it. And what this treaty says is it is going to create effectively a communist world government. The word communist doesn't appear, the word government does. But why do I say communist? Because there is no provision in the 200 words of the treaty, 200 pages, I'm sorry, of the treaty, for any election. The word election, the word ballot, the word democracy, the word elected official, the word voting, none of that appears at all. They are going to create a world government, and they use the word government, with powers of taxation, which can be imposed on all the states parties who signed the treaty, and powers of enforcement, so that they can order elected governments against the will of their electors to pay money to third world countries as what is called climate debt. They're saying that because we have burnt fossil fuels, and fossil fuels, as they would like us to believe, are damaging the climate, therefore we owe the third world a financial compensation for the bad weather that is going to result from this so-called effect on the climate. Now, all of this is going to be supervised not by an elected world government, and there is a case for saying that an elected world government might be something that we might find valuable at some stage in the future. But if you believe in democracy, as I think you do and I do, and certainly the United Kingdom used to believe in democracy, and the United States I think largely still does, then the notion of an unelected supreme government running the world is a very dangerous one. Now, of course, in the past, we have heard people like Sir Maurice Strong at the UN advocating world government, and of course they never meant elected world government. They always meant communist, centralist, unelected world government. But now this treaty is in draft, and it says they're going to set one up. And what's going to happen at Copenhagen is this. A lot of leaders of nations will go. Of course, Obama will go, Al Gore will go, James Hansen will go. They'll all go onto the platform together, and the keening zombies from the various nations will all stand up and applaud these Nobel Prize winners, etc., etc. And there'll be a terrific fellow feeling. And of course, there will be no agreement on who can burn how much fossil fuels. All that's too much detail. They won't agree on that. And so when they find they can't agree on that, the plan is that the UN will then say, well, all right, it's quite clear we can't get an agreement on exactly who can burn how much fossil fuels. So instead, why don't we just agree on making progress with the institutional framework? That's the phrase they'll use, institutional framework. What that means is communist world government. And the nations will agree to that. Why? The third world countries will agree because they have all been told they're going to make money out of this through the climate debt that we have incurred, and we're going to have to pay not just 0.7% of GDP that we already do to help out the third world, but another 0.7 on top by order of the world government. And if we try not to pay it, as some of us have tried not to pay it in the past, we'll be made to pay it, whether our electors want it or not, or whether our elected governments want it or not. They'll be made to pay by this world government. So all the third world countries are going to vote for this treaty because they can smell cash in it. A lot of the left-wing governments in the West, such as the EU, because Britain no longer has its own foreign policy, that's decided by the EU, dictatorship, which again we don't elect and can't remove and can't hold to account. There's a European Parliament, but it has no power to propose, decide or amend legislation. It's just there as a sort of Duma, a sort of piece of democratic-looking window dressing to hide the true nature of the dictatorship. What they're now going to do is to grow the EU into a world system. They're borrowing the EU system and making it a world system of government, whereby left-wing governments, such as that of Obama or Kevin Rudd in Australia, they will all vote for this too, because democracy doesn't mean anything to them. they'll be perfectly happy to see it die, rather glad to see it die. And so instead, there will only be a tiny handful of nations who will say, hang on a moment, this is going to cost us in the West a fortune. There's no reason for it because, as we now know, and we'll come on to this I expect later, there is no climate crisis. There is no problem whatsoever with the climate caused by us. And they will say, why should we sign this? But there won't be enough of them to stop it happening.
You've put in context why it's important to the average person. Do you have a notion of what it is that we can do to be effective advocates?
I think the first thing to do is to get in touch with your government by any means you can via your elected representatives and say to it that you are not prepared to allow your government to sign away your democracy at Copenhagen. And I think what we may need to do is to produce an instrument of repudiation, a sort of unilateral declaration of independence from this new treaty. Much as America herself, when she was founded, issued a unilateral declaration of independence, saying, we don't care whether anybody says we're independent or not, we say we're independent. And I think now individual people are going to need to sign up via the internet, perhaps via your website, to an instrument of repudiation that says this treaty does not speak for us because A, there is no climate crisis, B, even if there were, there's nothing realistically that can be done economically about it except at disproportionate cost, a cost which would fall chiefly on third world nations, actually. Already people are starving because of the way the climate scare has been mishandled. And 3, we're not, under any circumstances, going to have a world government imposed upon us unless that government is elected.
You talk about the pain involved. Obviously, whenever something like this is put in the public square, there are certain people that are going to benefit and benefit handsomely from such an arrangement. Can you speak to the enrichment aspect of it? Who wins?
Well, let's take the obvious example of Al Gore, for instance. He founded a company called Generation Investment Management Limited. It's a financial corporation, investment bank if you like, based in London. It would be a criminal offence to base it in the US because he is going around saying things about the climate which in the UK would amount to peddling a false prospectus because they're just not true. And peddling a false prospectus is financial fraud, and he would go to prison in the United Kingdom if he were to dare to say publicly there any of the things he says so frequently over here and elsewhere in the world. Now, to give you an example of how rich he has become by doing this, he has just taken the church commissioners of the Church of England in the United Kingdom for $200 million of so-called investment in so-called green, so-called technologies. Now, if the Copenhagen Treaty doesn't go through, all of those investments will be worthless, and the church commissioners will lose $200 million. And so will everybody else who's been foolish enough to put money into Gore's corporation. But Gore has already taken his fees. He gets a percentage of every investment that is put into his corporation. So he runs off to wherever he wants to run off to in the world on his private jet, as rich as Croesus, while those who have foolishly thought that green investments were a sensible investment financially will find that they only pay if there is subsidy, and without the Copenhagen Treaty those subsidies are going to start.